Hey now. If you're on this channel, chances are you're likely familiar with a certain angry nerd. Yeah, aren't we all? And if you watch the AVGN videos, you might agree that some of his most memorable ones are the ones that involve Bugs Bunny. First, the review of the Bugs Bunny Birthday Blowout on NES, and then a review of the Crazy Castle series, which started on the NES, moved to Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and eventually wound up on the Game Boy Advance with Bugs Bunny gone, replaced for some inexplicable reason by Woody Woodpecker. While I remember these episodes mostly for the great fight scenes between the nerd and Mike Matei in a Bugs Bunny costume, I personally was thrown by the fact that there were 5 Crazy Castle games. I mean, were they really popular enough to get that many sequels? And I wondered about the series as a whole. Were there perhaps more games in the series, and why did it change from Bugs Bunny to Woody Woodpecker? So I looked into it, and I found that it's a lot more complicated than you'd think. For example, Birthday Blowout is part of the same series as Crazy Castle, and the hero of the series wasn't originally Bugs Bunny, it was Roger Rabbit. And in Japan, almost every game has a different protagonist than the ones that we got. Also, not all the games follow the Crazy Castle trope of finding keys, though many of them do. Some are different, such as Birthday Blowout, which is a spin-off that was more of a traditional platformer, albeit an average one. If there's one thing that ties the entire series together, with only one exception, is that they were all developed by Kemco and for the most part self-published. It all started when Kemco got the rights to make a game based off of the hit film Who Framed Roger Rabbit, though it had about as much to do with the movie as any other 8-bit license game had to do with their properties. Though they wanted to release the game outside of Japan, the issue was that there was already a Roger Rabbit game in the West, the one that you're familiar with, which was developed by Rare and published by LJN. So they bought the rights to the Looney Tunes characters and changed Roger Rabbit into Bugs Bunny, which is an easy fit as they're both rabbits, so it doesn't take a whole lot to alter the game, and it was released as the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle. The game was never released in Europe. The game was popular enough to get a sequel, but the problem was, at least in Japan, that Roger Rabbit was then yesterday's news. But due to the deal with the Roger Rabbit characters, they also had license to use the Disney characters who appeared in Roger Rabbit. Now you might wonder why they had the rights to Disney stuff already, while they had to separately buy the rights to Looney Tunes for the Americanization of the first game. And that's a good question. The answer is, it had nothing to do with the characters appearing in the movie, but it had to do with the movie studio. Who Framed Roger Rabbit was produced by Touchstone Pictures, which was owned by Disney. So that's how it happened. So the second game, which was released for Game Boy, was released as Mickey Mouse. Outside of Japan, they kept the already existing license for Looney Tunes and released the Game Boy sequel as simply Bugs Bunny. Now note, it is a sequel, and it's on Game Boy, but it's not the one that was shown in the AVGN video. That one is called the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 2. The reason that it wasn't shown in AVGN's video is likely that he wasn't aware of the game, as it's not apparently part of the series, just from the title. After all, it's just called Bugs Bunny, and it doesn't have Crazy Castle in the title. And there was a Game Boy sequel that had an obvious title. So I'm sure the nerd would just be chuffed as hell to learn that there's another Crazy Castle game that he didn't play. Or maybe he'd be glad. What's interesting is that originally they were going to call the game Bugs Bunny Funhouse, but shortened it to Bugs Bunny upon release. The game was released in Europe where it was simply called the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle. Now this is interesting because as far as Europe is concerned, it was the original game, as the first NES title had not been released there. But now you European viewers know that it wasn't the original game at all, but rather the sequel. The third game was the spin-off on the NES, the one we know as the Bugs Bunny Birthday Blowout. In Japan, it's called Happy Birthday Bugs and is pretty much the same game. And it's only one of 2 games in the series that used bugs in Japan. The reason why it was bugs is obvious. The entire concept of the game is revolved around the 50th anniversary of the Bugs character. Even the storyline follows this. In Europe, it was released as the Bugs Bunny Blowout. I guess they felt the need to take birthday out of the title for whatever reason. The fourth game returns to the Game Boy and also to the traditional key-collecting gameplay. And once again, in Japan, the hero was Mickey Mouse. It was simply called Mickey Mouse 2 in Japan, while in America it's the Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 2. This is the first sequel you saw in that AVGN video. Now the European version is interesting because there's two. One is just like the Japanese version and was simply called Mickey Mouse despite being a sequel. The other version is based off of the Danish cartoon Hugo, but they are the same game. Game number 5 brought it back to the NES, where in Japan Mickey Mouse was in a platformer game using balloons to float around, and it was heavy on the mini-games. In Japan, it's known as Mickey Mouse 3 Balloon Dreams. This was brought to America, but they didn't use Bugs for this one because the whole balloon thing doesn't really fit with Bugs as it is, and they couldn't use Mickey because Capcom held the exclusive rights to Disney properties in American games. So completely new characters and settings were created for the game, which was released as Kid Clown in Nightmare World. Though it's part of the Crazy Castle series, Kid Clown got several sequels that were not part of the series. But it's also got one that was part of the Crazy Castle series, so I'll wait a bit to talk about the sequels to it. This game was not released in Europe. In the meantime, let's move on to game number 6. This one returns to the Game Boy and has Mickey Mouse in a platform game entitled Mickey Mouse 4 The Magical Labyrinth. This one is really interesting because the American version is not based off of Bugs, but rather used an existing license that Kemco had, The Real Ghostbusters. It's also the only American release to not be published by Kemco, but rather it was published by Activision. The European version, however, is not based off of Mickey Mouse or Ghostbusters, but rather the Garfield and Friends cartoon, and was released there as Garfield Labyrinth. So this one came out in 3 regions at the exact same game, save for sprite swaps, to reflect the licenses of 3 different cartoons. Game number 7 is also on Game Boy, and in Japan it has Mickey Mouse in another platforming game entitled Mickey's Chase. Nothing too weird here. This time, when it was released in America and Europe, Capcom no longer had the exclusive rights to the Disney properties, and so Disney games are starting to come out, developed and published by other people. So the American and European releases came out as Mickey's Dangerous Chase. I guess they had to add the word dangerous in there to make it appeal to American and European gamers. American Kirby is hardcore. Game number 8 is the last one to use the Mickey Mouse character in Japan, as Kemco's license for Disney characters was running out. This one was on the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and in Japan is called Mickey Mouse 5 The Magical Stick. Yeah, stick. In America, the magical stick was called a wand, which makes a lot more sense, and the game was called Mickey Mouse Magical Wands. This one was not released in Europe. Game number 9 is another weird one, as it has 2 separate releases in Japan with 2 separate licenses, neither of which was Mickey Mouse, as Kemco no longer had the Disney license. This one was also released for both Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Well, actually, I have to backtrack a little bit and talk about Kid Clown. Remember that bastard? Yeah. As I mentioned, Kid Clown got a number of sequels that were not part of the Crazy Castle series, and one that was. The first sequel was Kid Clown in Crazy Chase for the Super NES, which was also released for the Game Boy Advance as simply Crazy Chase. The next was Kid Clown in Crazy Chase 2 Love Love Hani Sudatsusen for PlayStation. As you might guess, that one was not released in America. The next sequel was the first Japanese release of the 9th Crazy Castle game, which was literally translated as Let's Go, Kid, Go, Go, Kid. Yeah, they really called it that. Later on, they re-released the same game in Japan, only with Kid Clown swapped out for Bugs Bunny, and called it Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 3, which is also how it was released in America and Europe. Just for posterity, I should mention that there was one more Kid Clown game after that, not a part of the Crazy Castle series, though. That one was The Bombing Islands on PlayStation, which also hit the Nintendo 64 under the title Charlie's Blast Territory. This one is just strange because although they initially just used Kid Clown, they did eventually re-release it in Japan as Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 3, even though the Japanese had never heard the term Crazy Castle before in this series, and it was the fourth key collecting game to come out there, not the third. Just seems weird how it conformed to the American and European name. It's also weird because in Europe there was a Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle, which was really the second game, as the first wasn't out in Europe, and a Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 3, which is this game, but there wasn't a 2. It's just one of those things, I guess. Game number 10 on the Game Boy Color is Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 4, once again conforming to the American naming structure. This was released in both Japan and America exactly the same, and was strangely not released in Europe. The 11th game was the final one, and this was Woody Woodpecker Crazy Castle 5 for Game Boy Advance. It's Woody in all regions, and the reasoning is simply that Kemco no longer had the rights to either Warner Brothers or Disney properties. But they did have the rights to Universal Studios properties, and they had already released Universal Studios Theme Park Adventures on GameCube, which featured Woody Woodpecker as a main character. So they used Woody for the final Crazy Castle game. The name is not much different in the regions. In Japan and Europe, it's Woody Woodpecker Crazy Castle 5, while they added a conjunction in America, so it was Woody Woodpecker in Crazy Castle 5. Once again, I should point out that as far as the games actually named Crazy Castle in Europe, they only have a 1, a 3, and a 5. I guess Kemco had an issue releasing even-numbered games there. And of course, remember that their 1 is the second game, which in Japan was Mickey Mouse 2, but in America was simply Bugs Bunny. Man, that series is a lot more confusing than you'd think it was. Join me next week, and we'll talk about something significantly less mind-bending, though still a point of contention with many old-school gamers. What to do when a popular character just ups and changes their name.